Hello, I'm Kate Fitzgerald from the Learning Hack team, welcoming you to the first episode of Great Minds on Learning. This season is brought to you by Learning Pool, the company that helps you deliver exceptional performance with pioneering online learning platforms, creative content and powerful analytics. In this series, Donald Clark, the internationally famous author, blogger and entrepreneur, joins John Helmer to discuss the history of thought and theorising about learning. It's all here, the inspired, the enduring, the whacked out weird and the just plain wrong in 2,500 years of learning theory from the Greeks to the geeks. This episode is about the Behaviorists.
So Donald, the Behaviorists. This is a group of learning theorists who tend to inspire negative reactions, and I'm guessing a lot of people will be settling in for a bit of a hatchet job. But there's a lot more to behaviorism than that. There's light as well as shade. It's a complex story, meaning we've got a lot to cover. So Donald, can you kick us off by telling us what is behaviorism actually, and where does it come from? We tend to think of it as a US phenomenon, but what are its real roots?
Yes, behaviorism is often misunderstood, I think, because it's fundamentally a methodology. It's not a bunch of people or a thing. It's an approach to psychology with this real laser-like focus on science, and so they were inspired by the natural sciences. They wanted psychology really to be a bit like biology or physics or chemistry. And they wanted it to be experimental. Remember, William James, father of psychology wasn't an experimental guy, but the behaviorists certainly were. So they wanted to gather data that was verifiable, observable data, and that meant observable behavior, not subjective testimony, which they saw as unreliable. There had to be a physical manifestation of the phenomenon. That's not to say that they denied instinct, genetics, consciousness, subjectivity, and so on. As Chomsky kept telling people, they weren't stupid, these people. They understood what consciousness was. They just thought that type of evidence was beyond the scope of scientific inquiry. But your comment about people's reactions to behaviorism is quite interesting. Your mere mention of the word behaviorists, and you can hear people sort of saddling up their moral high horses.
An eye roll at the very least, I think.
Yeah. I mean, they're on the search for the bogeyman, to put into the box. The word box comes up all the time. But it's they that want to often close the lid and label it as sort of dangerous rubbish. But, it's a case of a little learning being a sort of dangerous thing. So you get this sort of tiresome reading of even people like Skinner or the mythology around Skinner's daughter being fed in a box and becoming mentally ill and committing suicide, all of which are wrong and mythological. And that there were a bunch. Yeah, she got sick giving interviews saying, look, she lives here in England, she's an artist, successful person, she got tired giving interviews denying this nonsense, but still the books were being published, and it still happens today. Or even this label of them being, authoritarian, sexist, fascist type. They were a broad spectrum of people here, and it's so easy to simplify. But I think it's important to remember that some of their work has stood the test of time, and we still have much to learn from them.
So where did they come from, and what were their roots?
Well, I think you're right in saying that it's fundamentally a US phenomenon. All the people apart from Pavlov, of course, who was Russian, were Americans, but really it has its roots in UK or British empiricism, sort of Hume, Locke and Mill, who saw the mind as a tabula rasa or a blank slate to be filled by experiences. So empiricism is, that learning from experience. And Locke's associatism saw the mind as having no innate structures. His learning theory was built on laws of association. So they're picking up on that traditional British empiricism. Another important feature was, remember, these people were by and large born in the second half of the 19th century, and as Dennett said, Darwin's dangerous idea had hit. They're living in the shadow of Darwin here. And that's an important concept because, suddenly humankind was de-anchored. We weren't God-created creatures. We were seen as animals, just, and denying the features of the mind that great psychologists such as William James thought were vital to psychology was one feature of them. Nevertheless, behaviorism was deeply rooted in this idea that we had a new place in the universe, as it were, and could be studied a bit like animals. And of course, we had animal psychology as well. You had people like Pavlov who come along who were looking at the process of learning in the animal world. That was the bedrock of psychology. But of course, it's obvious what its weaknesses were. It's often categorized by that famous joke, because they just looked at behavior and not internal testimony. The joke goes, what does a behaviorist say after sex? Well, it was good for you. How was it for me? Completely eliminating any personal feeling or consciousness or whatever. Or the famous, I love the little cartoon of the rat sitting on the corner with a placard saying, we'll press levers for food, as if the rat was only about that. It didn't have any other. But of course, they were far more sophisticated than you might think, many of these psychologists, and weren't as primitive. As I say, it was a methodology. And of course, as Pavlovian conditioning gave way to Watson's behaviorist sort of manifesto, and then Skinner's form of behavior, and then we have quite sophisticated thinking beyond that in Thorndike, Tolman, and on into Bandura. It changed over time, over half a century.
So Bandura, the last surviving member of this group, until last week, died days before the recording of this episode, sadly.
Yes.
Can you give us a timeline, situate them all in time, and tell us to what extent they overlapped, responded to each other's work? How much continuity is there actually in the story of behaviorist thought? Are they really a group?
Well, in time, of course, Pavlov was I think born about 1850 or so, so that was the second half of the 19th century. Watson also was born in the 1870s. And then Thorndike also. But beyond that, once we get to Skinner's very much a 20th century person. He was born in the 20th century, and of course Bandura has just recently died. So there's a solid little clump at the beginning who are in the shadow of Darwin, late 19th century. Remember, Origin of the Species, published 1859, and then a couple who come along a bit later, Thorndike, Skinner and Tolman, and then of course Bandura, who's a bridge into cognitive psychology. It's fundamentally, though, these people were active and knew each other. Skinner famously went along to a lecture when Pavlov was at Harvard, I think, and met him and got a signed photograph, which was always on his wall in his study. So they certainly knew each other. This was a powerful movement. And of course, they were quite famous in their day. They appeared on television. The Skinner was a bit of a celebrity in many ways.
So it all starts in Russia with Pavlov, not a psychologist. When he wins the Nobel Prize for Physiology in 1904, it's for work on the digestive system of dogs.
Yeah.
Very close to both of our hearts as dog owners.
Yes.
And it's by observing the dogs he is studying, and in particular their saliva glands and gastric juices, that he almost stumbles over the discovery that makes him world famous. Classical conditioning.
Yes.
Pavlov's dogs, stimulus and response. This stuff is something that everybody knows now. It's embedded in our language and our thought. Can you tell us about his experiments, Donald, and why he's so important for the theory of learning?
Yeah, well, I know that you, like me, are very, very fond of our dogs. And if you have a dog, the first thing you'll notice is that the merest rustle of a piece of paper or any noise in the kitchen, and they're at your feet. And of course, this is what Pavlov's experiments built on. And he did get the Nobel Prize for physiology, not psychology, not for conditioned reflexes. But this led him, interestingly, his work on the production of saliva and gastric juices led to this notion of the behavior of dogs, hence behaviorism. He wasn't really a behaviorist, remember. He did believe in the deep study of the psyche or subjective experience. If you had accused Pavlov of being a behaviorist, he would have looked at you with a rather odd stare, I think. Nevertheless, to come to his experiments, I mean, some of this was quite cruel for its day and not unusual, perhaps. But we still have animal experimentation today, so let's not imagine that we're, completely innocent in all this. But I mean, he killed off 30 of the dogs in the surgical procedure on one of his experiments, and his dogs were rounded up by thieves. He paid for them to be stolen, some of which turned out to be pets. But these were different times, very, very certainly. But to come to the experiments themselves, it's often thought that the important thing about the unconditioned stimulus was that's a natural response. as we just said, if you have a dog, even the sight, smell of food causes the dog to salivate or run to you, as it were. Okay, so and if you immediately ring a bell, however, and this was the big mistake that most people made, it wasn't a bell, it was actually a buzzer or metronome. We've used various devices actually and played around with a metronome at different speeds and so on. It was a really detailed, data-driven experimentation. These notebooks are immense. You know, the amount of data he gathered was beyond belief. So the unconditioned response is the dog just responding. The conditioned response is, however, an attempt to replace that unconditioned response with a new response in real life, a metronome or a buzzer, or as the myth goes, a bell. And of course, you can transfer that, and the dog now associates the bell with food. And if the experiment is reversed, of course, there's another interesting finding, and no food accompanies the bell, the response sort of eventually disappears, and that's called extinction. So I think this was the grounding. This is why Skinner loved Pavlov. He gave them that basic principle of positive reinforcement being a good thing, negative or absence of reinforcement being a bad thing in learning theory. In other words, things will just fade away, as we know, a la Ebbinghaus we've discussed previously. So I think that's an interesting, foundation stone, positive reinforcement. That's what we got from Pavlov's experimentation.
And did he experiment on humans at all? Did he do some
child? It would be a mistake to think that he did the same sort of experiments with gastric juices and saliva and so on. He certainly didn't.
We should say that with the dogs, he actually externalized the saliva glands, didn't he? Which is
That's correct. I mean, it was
that you couldn't do that with a baby.
No, that would be immensely cruel. That's not to say that he didn't have an interest in the human psyche, human consciousness, and indeed, if you know this, but in his later research was really into, really the disorientation of humans to create this sort of disordered or unstable states.
Yeah.
And he was supported by, it's important to remember, he wasn't really a communist in the sense he visited the United States. He didn't like the Bolsheviks. He actually trained as a priest when he was younger and really hated the Bolshevik attempt to get rid of religion. He thought that religion played a very powerful and important moral role in human affairs.
But they liked him, didn't they? He was really popular with the Soviet authorities and a big enough noise that he felt secure enough to call out Stalin for his treatment of other intellectuals and write angry letters to Molotov, actually. So
that's correct.
What made his Wikipedia entry. That version of the thing, doesn't it mask a darker truth about his involvement with techniques of psychological torture?
Well, I think we can exaggerate this a little bit. Yes, the Soviets, the communists loved him, of course, because he had a Nobel Prize. So he was a star in their eyes. That was 1904. The revolution comes along in 1915. And by 1918, he's getting quite critical, writing letters about, it's a dangerous thing to do in that era. Nevertheless, he was confident enough to be able to make those statements because he really, that's why I say he wasn't really a communist in that sense, politically or otherwise. And this is important from the psychology point of view. Some have argued that his later research, I think his influence wasn't really in that mind control thing. It was never followed through into actual, application in the real world. Mm-hmm. But I think a more positive side of his interest in human psychology was another legacy, perhaps, that his later research influenced another quite famous German psychologist called Kurt Lewin. Now, this had a good and a bad effect. Lewin moved to the US in the 30s and influenced John Dewey, so it's an indirect route here. Yeah. And this led to this whole word teaching, which was such a disaster. And this is quite recent. My kids got this at primary school. In other words, the idea that teach literacy not by pointing out the mistakes or correcting spelling and so on, but through the positive reinforcement and of whole words. This was a disaster, which is why we now have phonics as a compulsory component in literacy teaching in schools, although it's still a problem in the US. So although Pavlov's work, it didn't have really any direct bearing on education and training, but it did indirectly through Lewin. So there's a bit of a legacy there. Of course, his main legacy would have been this influence on people like Watson and Skinner, because the stimulus response idea was taken very seriously by them in terms of positive stimuli good and negative stimuli bad. The reinforcement being the driver of learning.
let's move on to John Watson now, 1878 to 1958.
Yeah.
So we're not at home to knee-jerk reactions when it comes to behaviorists, but I can't help noting that we now moved from a vivisectionist who pioneered a bit of psychological torture, I mean, maybe that's over-egging it, to a madman. Not a literal madman, more a Madison Avenue type, as in the Netflix series Mad Men. John B. Watson of South Carolina, son of an alcoholic polygamist who abandoned the family when Watson was 13, began his academic career studying philosophy under John Dewey, and ended it when he was chucked out of Johns Hopkins University for running off with a student 20 years his junior, in the course of that, abandoning his own family in the process. So he then went off with her to write a book about parenting, go figure, only to then become VP at the famous advertising agency J. Walter Thompson on Madison Avenue at the time, where he pioneered techniques of consumer manipulation. Well, consumer manipulation, that's another word for advertising. His Little Albert experiment on a 9-month-old boy, it was one of the most controversial in the whole of psychology, a field where there are quite a lot of controversial experiments. And I've gone straight to the dark side here, Donald, but in fact, he was a serious scientist, wasn't he? Which you just wouldn't pick up on from reading that Wikipedia entry. And he made important discoveries, and what were they?
Well, the fact that he hung around with one of his students. I mean, I think even I remember that at university with academics. So I don't think that was anything particularly startling. You're right, though. I think he's known fundamentally as the progenitor of serious behaviorism, because it was his Columbia address, Psychology as a Behaviorist Views It, in 1913, that really launched it was a manifesto for behaviorism. In other words, with his background in animal research, he really wanted to define psychology in terms of the scientific method, this objective natural science, the goal to study observable behavior, and to break down this distinction between humans and animals. And he built on Pavlov's idea of conditioned reflex. Of course, that's important, to gather that type of data, avoiding the subjective and therefore error-prone interpretation. And the Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It really was a serious document and really launched this movement with some verve, as it were. But his angle in all this was really, as you rightly said, focused around child rearing. That his psychological care of the infant and child was a key text. That's what led to the Little Albert experiment, and then we can talk about advertising. But child rearing was of some interest to him.
He really was a game of two halves of Watson, it seems. Can you sum up for us in terms of his influence on learning theory? What was the good stuff and what was less good?
Well, of course, he's set and trained behaviorism. That's probably his main contribution here. Just a word a little bit about the child rearing thing, because I think that had a massive influence throughout the 20th century. He recommended this use of behaviorism to infants and children. And the strict behaviorism was the idea that you have to almost condition your child. But let's not imagine that hothouse parenting doesn't exist. If anything, it's stronger now than it's ever been. So this approach had a profound and long-lasting effect on child rearing and practice that's evident in the sort of obsessive view we have of education as being cramming people, parents hiring tutors and cramming the kids for exams and so on. That dark side of Watson's behaviorism, I think, is a result to a degree of that, because he influenced the entire literature about parenting. Now, the Little Albert experiment, is worth talking about that a little bit, because he took what was essentially a 9-month child who turned out to have learning problems and disabilities, in fact. The child actually died at 6 years old, he found out later. This is a tragic affair, but Watson did some conditioning on this child, but what he failed to do was decondition the child, and that was seen as now quite an unethical approach. But these are the early days of experimental psychology, but he can still be criticized for that. It's a very famous example. It's used more as an example of how not to do things, rather than the idea of Watson being completely mad and crazy. I think, he's a man like most of these people had good hearts. They were perhaps fixated by their beliefs, but nevertheless did good things. There was, of course, another influence here in advertising. That's quite interesting, because at that time, you have this sort of growth in consumer advertising. And as television came in much later, it's hardly surprising that advertisers loved behaviorism, because they could then work to a methodology that would reinforce good messages and avoid negative messages and sell more product. And actually, he was supposedly responsible for the famous coffee break, the mid-morning coffee break.
Yeah.
And that was around the I think it was Maxwell House campaign that he was in charge of. He rose to quite a high level in Thomson, the advertising agent.
It was a VP. Yeah.
That's right. So that was the beginning of that. But again, the advertising industry is massive and huge. There's lots of young people working in marketing who would quite happily criticize the behaviorists, but actually that's their job. So
yes.
Another thing I find often about people who rush to really condemn or put the behaviorists in a box is that at the very same time they've fallen into the trap of accepting social constructivism, which is basically a form of neo-behaviorism. In other words, the mind is a tabula rasa or blank slate, and its social influences change everything. So, that whole postmodern world of, gender, sex, and so on is all a social construct. It's really quite behaviorist in its approach.
Yeah.
So I don't think people understand that they themselves are often being behaviorists when they come at science from that angle.
You mentioned the blank slate. Is Watson responsible for the blank slate idea?
Well, not really. That, as I say, that goes back to people like Locke and Mill. The British empiricists really had that view. It's not that they denied instinct and so on, but pre-Darwin, that was the general view of the mind. It was either a rational mind, because it had been God created, or it was an empirical mind. In other words, everything we gathered was from sensory data. So the blank slate was, the dominant view of the mind. Of course, Darwin put an end to that because it was clear that the mind then became an evolved organ, had this legacy, and it brought there was lots in there before you even start with any learning intervention.
Yeah, so we should explain that the blank slate is a quite important concept in psychology, that some people believe children start not knowing anything, and everything kind of has to be put in and written on that blank slate, as it were. And other people believe there are innate capabilities and predispositions and so on.
I mean, to be fair, hardly any professional psychologist would believe in the tabula rasa or blank slate, as it were, apart from, this postmodern sort of weird critical theory type people. But that's not science at all. That's, in a sense, in my view, ideology. But I think no serious psychologist would believe that it is a blank slate. You might not go as far as Chomsky in saying that you have universal grammar and so on, but there are still clearly hormonal influences. There's an evolutionary a legacy in the brain. It comes to language learning, face recognition, a whole number of things, learning to walk. It comes to the game with already preset innate patterns, fear of snakes and phobias and so on.
The way we work has changed, and the way we learn is changing too. But 70% of organisations don't feel that their learning systems can really cope with all this change. It seems there is a disconnect between what learners need right now and what most learning suites provide. In a new white paper, Ben Betts and I tell the story of how this disconnect happened and lay out a vision for what a modern learning system ought to be and do. It's called Sweet Dreams, and you can read it now. So it's time now to move on to B.F. Skinner. What can we say about B.F. Skinner? From Pennsylvania, Harvard professor, failed novelist, dangerous people they are. He was, for a time, perhaps the most famous public intellectual in the US. He went on the Dick Cavett show in an era when a lot of people truly seemed to believe that science was going to make a better world. It's kind of post-World War world, especially in the 50s. And I think Skinner believed that as well. And his fame endures, but now it seems more as a hate figure. Let's start with what he contributes to behaviorism and the important discoveries he made that advanced our knowledge of learning.
Yes, well, building on Pavlov, really, he takes the findings in conditioning, so we've discussed that already, and he brings in the notion of behaviorism in learning through positive reinforcement as opposed to negative reinforcement. So his early work, you're right, he came to psychology quite late. I think he may have studied English originally. But he looked at animals, specifically pigeons and rats, and built these in the box. This is what Skinner's box was. It wasn't for putting children in, it was putting for pigeons and rats. And then started to do experimental work on what really made them learn faster, what accelerated learning. And so they had to press various levers for food and so on. So in his Behavior of Organism, that's 1938, he then really takes this notion of positive reinforcement and brings it to the table. That's operant conditioning is what that is called. All behavior is reinforced through repeated stimuli. And of course, we see that reflected in really good science now in things like retrieval practice, space practice, deliberate practice. So he was by and large right on this. You know, it's not the whole story, but it's certainly an important part of the story. And I think while we're there, we should just knock on the head this idea that he experimented on human beings by putting them in boxes and so on. This just was not true. A whole mythology has been built around them, which is really, again, ideologues coming to the behaviorist table and just deliberately looking for things to pick out here. And even going beyond that, you know, into, you see, a failed novelist, he did actually write a novel, Walden 2, and before we get to that, we might want to also discuss his role in teaching machines, because he wasn't the first, but he certainly put a great deal of effort into applying this notion of positive reinforcement in building machines.
So let's get on to the teaching machines. Like Watson, he thought a lot about child rearing and education. And one of the most interesting things he worked on was a sort of precursor of an e-learning system, if you like, in the mechanical teaching machine he tried unsuccessfully to bring to market. Now, it's interesting that Skinner in his early years was a bit of an inventor with a friend of his. They set up a telegraph system so that they could communicate with each other, between their bedrooms, and a machine for kind of helping to pick blueberries properly. So he always had an interest in mechanical inventions. Yeah. Now, Audrey Waters tells the story in her book Teaching Machines of how he tried to develop a teaching machine. And it seems that Skinner had a precursor there in Sidney Pressey in the 20s. So how significant were these attempts to mechanize learning?
Yeah, well, you're right. There are two major figures here, Pressey and Skinner. Pressey was much earlier. His teaching, I mean, he first came up with the idea in 1915, and he built it after then it was the World War I, and he built it in 1920 or so. And in funny sort of way, Pressey was Pressey was not a behaviorist. He was the antithesis of Skinner. He really hated Skinner. But remember, a lot of psychologists around that time were not behaviorists. We have people like Macy Clark and her work on race. She was a black psychologist. There were lots of people who didn't buy into the behaviorism kick, although she had behaviorist aspects to her experiments with dolls. But coming back to Pressey, he had a sort of multiple choice machine that issued candy and so on. And also it was quite sophisticated, actually, because he believed that even when you got the wrong answer, let's say C was wrong and pressing the C key, that was a good learning experience that you learned from error. Now, Skinner came along, I mean, nearly 40 years later in the 50s and built his machine, but it was quite sophisticated. So I think Audrey is wrong in saying this was a behaviorist phenomenon. Pressey was not a behaviorist, and she lumps them all together. But Skinner comes along and builds a machine that was actually quite sophisticated. It had these discs, and on the radii of the disc it had questions, and then it had open input. It had a bit where you could actually write your answer. I mean, how often do we see that in even online learning these days? Hardly, it's all multiple choice questions still. Yeah. And so, he had thought a lot about this. It wasn't sort of Mickey Mouse and primitively behaviorist in any sense. He really did believe in autonomous learning. So the learner would actually write their answer and then scroll forward and compare it to a model answer. And everything was geared, it was literally a mechanical device, towards learning through positive reinforcement and being an autonomous learning. Now, both Pressey and Skinner thought this was a huge advance because it would save teachers from marking. And there's still there are arguments for the use of technology in learning are as true and powerful today as they were then. If teachers really want to save a lot of time and get out of the sort of mundane tasks, then we should be automating them. And that's what's come to pass with online learning, in fact. So they were prescient. They had the machines they built were actually quite sophisticated and interesting, and we have a lot to learn from them. In terms of learning theory, but also in the technology of learning. I think that's quite important.
And of course, they brought personalization into it through the use of technology, which is now a commonplace in workplace learning, if not in education necessarily, although they called it not personalization, but individualization of education.
Yes, that's right. I mean, the machines were barely individualized. They were, because they didn't have any software. They were mechanical devices, lots of levers and cogs and so on. And of course, it's a mistake to think that, of course, most people who are involved in adaptive learning, and I myself have been heavily involved in the building of adaptive learning systems. One of the biggest in the world has just been sold to a university. And these people don't know about Pressey or Skinner. You know, the modern, I think this is where Audrey's mistake is, the idea that they created this world. They didn't at all. This was a long distant past. The sort of adaptive learning systems that are built now by AI people and so on, they have no knowledge of Pressey or indeed Skinner. And indeed, the software that's available when the personal computer came along in the 1970s was far more advanced in terms of what it could do, in terms of branching, decision-making, the use of data, way, way beyond that model of behaviorism. And so, interestingly, Pressey had quite an interesting view of, of blended learning as well. Both he and Skinner believed that the teacher had an incredibly important role here, and that these machines merely replaced the spade work, the marking and the assessment, and gave learners a bit of autonomy. They by no means agreed in the getting rid of teachers, although they did think that a sort of industrial revolution was needed in the education system.
Okay, so we've covered the big three behaviorists, and now we get to the also-rans in the fame stakes. But in a way, this is where it gets really interesting, because the next three might be less extreme in their views and as personalities, but they probably all deserve a lot more attention than they usually get. So let's start with Edward Thorndike from Massachusetts. Definitely a psychologist, served as president of the American Psychological Association, worked with William James, and spent nearly his entire career at Teachers College, Columbia University, New York. And his importance lay in bringing more experimental rigor to psychology and two important laws that he formulated. Can you start by telling us about his experiments, Donald?
Yeah, Thorndike was interesting because he did want to move on to human experimentation and the study of the human mind, but it was actually Harvard, his university, that stopped him from that. And so he had to go back to working with cats and chickens, which annoyed him slightly. But and then he writes his first major text still in the 19th century, I think, Animal Behavior. But he was very interested in moving he was a precursor to Skinner and Watson, but his interests were slightly different. And so his two laws of learning, the animal experimentation work led to these two laws, remember. They were sort of based on the behaviorist stimulus response model, but were slightly different. The law of effect, that was that consequences, either rewards or punishments, were a necessary condition for learning. So that's fairly classic behaviorist stuff. Tolman, we'll talk about him later, didn't believe this. The second was a more famous law, and that was the law of exercise, that learned behavior fades without practice. So we know about Ebbinghaus, we know about space practice, we know about the forgetting curve. And of course, his law of exercise thought that the driver behind learning had to be this focus on rewards and repeated practice. And that was to dominate behaviorist psychology and Skinner and others for decades, and is still with us today as a very strong legacy. And then the next big contribution, which is still really important to this day, is that word transfer. Mm-hmm. And this notion that, it's one thing to learn and have knowledge, it's quite another to be able to apply that in the real world. How do we get that transfer from the learning experience into being able to do things in the real world? And an important early finding in his work was this notion that transfer was an ignored issue, and that learning was not always just an end in itself, but a means to an end, that means being the application of knowledge. And he showed that what you had to do in the learning experience was contextualize it. In other words, you had to make the learning experience as close to the real world experience and in a congruent fashion to make it transfer. Now, we know a lot about this now, and we have had some amazing literature and work done in the late 20th century around the personal attitudes and motivational attitudes you have to encourage transfer of learning, the training attitudes, what makes training successful in terms of transfer. We know a lot about that now through experimental work. and of course the organizational context. How do you make this work once people go back into the workplace? Now, this is by and large still ignored, I think, by online learning, but it's incredibly important. It's incredibly important that if we're spending all this money on training, on, let's say, diversity training or unconscious bias or whatever it is, does it really work in the real world when people go back to the ranch? Or does it just remain as knowledge, inert knowledge, and the memory of the learning experience itself? My fear is that we haven't really learned enough from Thorndike. So, this week we had our Secretary of State for Education trying to pump Latin back into schools. Now, we know that Latin has no transferable skills. In fact, it can inhibit the learning of a second language like Spanish. Hassan Stern's famous experiment where they took one group who had learned German, another who had learned Latin. Both groups then went on to learn Spanish. The Latin group did worse because they had transferred false endings from Latin into the Spanish sentences, because it's a declensional language. So you can get this false negative transfer, which is destructive in learning. And this I've always argued is a real weakness with multiple choice questions, where you may have like 3 out of the 4 things are actually the wrong answer. So what you get is the transfer of the wrong answer in the head of the child moving forward. I did a big quality assurance thing for the BBC on BBC Bite Size. And they had questions like, what comes out the top of a volcano? Is it lava? Is it magma? Or is it chocolate? Now, I can guarantee if you test a 7-year-old 3 weeks later and what they think comes out, the one thing they will remember is the word chocolate. So negative reinforcement, negative transfer can be a big problem. And we're still working through this because we now have a huge rush in the training world to apply LXPs, learning in the workflow, learning in the workplace. Yeah. This is all about transfer. So I think Thorndike is someone to pay real attention to.
So well ahead of his time. And it's interesting that kind of red thread goes of space practice and so on, goes all the way through Ebbinghaus, and is still current in this group of the Behaviorists. We now need to get on to Tolman. 1886 to 1959, from the East Coast to the West.
Yep.
He was born in Massachusetts as well, as like Thorndike, also influenced by William James, but he was a professor of psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, so the other coast. Gestalt psychology was also important in shaping his thinking. Some really important discoveries with lasting importance: latent learning, cognitive maps. This might sound a bit crude as an observation, Donald, but maybe we begin to get a sense in Tolman's work of stuff that the other big ticket, blank slate type behaviorists leave out of their account of learning. Isn't this the problem that people find with the behaviorists, that they just, because they ignore the mind, they leave an awful lot of stuff out? And maybe some of this gets put back in with Tolman. Is that too crude? Anyway, we should start the experiments. So it's back to rats in mazes.
Yes, it is. No, you're right in seeing Tolman as someone who expanded the canvas somewhat. Okay. He had been to Germany, had been familiar with Gestalt psychology, came back and did something that I think also in this issue of, were the behaviorists a bunch of sort of fascists or not? He was a very progressive man and fought strongly and viciously for academic freedom during the McCarthy years, which was quite dangerous at the time. He really put his whole career on the line for that. So he was a progressive in that sense of the word. But he did something, I think, that was quite astonishing that we should think of today and often don't, and that's this idea of latent learning. So, rats and mazes. You have 3 groups of rats in a maze. One has the classic conditioning, and learns very quickly to go through the maze, press the lever, get the food on the basis of a stimulus that's constantly reinforced over 11 days. They get really good at this really quickly. A second group are just wandering around the maze. The food is there with no reinforcement. Interestingly, a third group are allowed to wander around the maze for 10 days, but on the 11th day, they get the reinforcement. And he finds that they learn super quickly. They become as good as the first group. Now, this goes against the pure, you need to reinforce learning over a long period of time in order to teach people how to do something. Because what those rats had been doing is just getting on with just milling about the maze, but they'd been learning almost unintentionally, or incidentally. And so he introduces this notion of latent learning that's incredibly important. Other subsequent experiments by people like Stevenson showed that children also had this form of latent learning, and experiments on unlocking boxes with keys. But we actually, the bottom line is that we learn just by doing. We learn in the workplace just by doing our job. It's only recently, of course, that the online learning world has recognized that this is true with workflow learning and so on. But really, it was Tolman who came up with the concept of latent learning. And I think he's worth studying for that. We now, if we leap into the 1990s, where people like Marek and Watkins, the book Informal and Incidental Learning, that's published in 1990, they wrote a whole book about this, latent learning, incidental learning, with Gloria Gary in 1991, who talks about unintentional learning, Jay Cross, informal learning. But it's taken us a good 20, 30 years to actually manifest that self in the sort of online learning world, paying attention to the fact that people actually don't like to go on courses necessarily. They can be important for some tasks still, but they like to learn in the flow as they go. So really Tolman was fundamental to this. And he brought in on the back of this the notion of cognitive maps. In other words, he speculated that the rats had built a sort of cognitive map of the maze just by wandering around and bumping into the walls and each other. And so the concept of cognitive maps, it's faded a little bit in psychology, but that was way back in 1948 where he talked about cognitive maps in rats and men. So he was applying behaviorism to the mind of humans as well as animals by that time, way back in 1948. So an important figure here.
So the next figure brings us right up to date. Albert Bandura, who died just a week ago before the recording of this episode. Canadian by birth, worked at Stanford for most of his life, was the fourth most frequently cited psychologist of all time. From a study in, I think, 2002. Known for social learning theory and his work on aggression and self-efficacy. He's a bit of a transitional figure, this one, isn't he, Donald? Forms a bridge between behaviorism and cognitive psychology.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a big change here. And he had behavioral elements here. So he brings in social learning theory. I think there are all sorts of disasters have unfolded since then, I think, around social learning theory. He was aware of its dangers here and renamed it social cognitive theory. He dropped the word learning because he thought the great danger was all learning is social, which he didn't believe, in fact. But what he did believe in this bridging between behaviorism into cognitive psychology is that we learn by observation. He's still an empiricist. We still observe the world. But proactively, we observe other behavior and we model our behavior. Others can model behavior and we watch their modeled behavior. So he brings in a whole number of new criteria for learning over and above reinforcement, either negative or positive reinforcement. He thinks that attention is a necessary condition for learning. That's quite important. We all know that's true now. He also brings in the notion of encoding, storing and retaining knowledge and bringing knowledge to the party when you apply even a skill. This notion of motor reproduction. In other words, we learn to play tennis or drive a car. We are often modeled by seeing other people do it. But this reinforcement of kinesthetic patterns in the brain, neuromuscular.
What people call muscle memory.
Yes, that's right. And that's right. Falsificate, of course, muscles have no memory whatsoever, all the memory in the brain. But that's right. He placed a great deal of focus on learning by doing. And of course, motivation and reinforcement. So you have those elements of behaviorism, but in a more sophisticated manner being applied to what he called modeling theory. That's observing a model, imitating a model, and understanding the consequences of the model in terms of what you do. So if you're learning how to do a serve at tennis, you'd observe the good practice of your coach. They might hold your hand and you would actually do it yourself. The modeling, you then try and imitate that in your mind and practice. And then understand the consequences of what you do, see whether it gets in the box or it goes over the net or whatever. This modeling theory became quite important and still is. Self-efficacy, you mentioned, again, this notion you have of yourself as being a competent learner, what was your internal capability was quite important for Bandura around both knowledge and skills, because that helps to shape your motivation going forward. So that notion of the importance of feedback, which we have from all sorts of theorists these days, is coming. The idea that feedback is really about feeding forward or learning. It propels the learner forward in the learning journey and the learning experience. He brings that into play. The behaviorists had already thought, in a sense, that reinforcement was a form of feedback. Okay. And then he takes that over into some other experiments on TV, which are relevant for, the modern discussion around video games and computer games and aggression and so on.
I've heard mirror neurons mentioned in connection with his work, which kind of emphasizes the point that he comes forward into the era of developments in neuroscience, which we hear a lot about nowadays, perhaps too much.
Yes, well, interestingly, mirror neuron research has varied somewhat. People think that there are some people who think they do not exist at all, and others who are very strong proponents of mirror neurons. Nevertheless, there is something very interesting has happened around this notion of modeling and how the brain works, which is massively behaviorist. So it's a really interesting example. So Neuralink, Elon Musk's company that puts these very fine threads into the brain in the hope of solving disabilities and depression and mental issues and so on. They have this amazing video that is really, I think everyone should watch, who's involved in learning should watch this video, of a monkey playing Pong, that old computer game, using a joystick and getting a feed of banana milkshake when they play the game correctly. And the monkey's really good at Pong. Suddenly they click over into interpreting the signals coming from these very thin fibers in the brain through the Neuralink system, using AI to interpret the data. And they unplug the joystick. So essentially the monkey is playing the game just by thinking, going through fibers. And it still is as good at Pong as it was with the joystick. So it's literally direct data, behaviorist data, read observable data from the physiology of the brain, as behaviorists would like it, is actually being interpreted and used to shape the behavior of the monkey and read what the brain is doing. It's 100% behaviorist in a sense. And so we've come full circle. How interesting. There were actually, one of the things about behaviorism, neo-behaviorism, modern behaviorism, is we're not looking at simple kinesthetic behavior of the human being, but we're actually digging into the neural network level, eye tracking, all sorts of interesting things are happening here. And so Bandura was right here, taking it further, broadening the canvas.
So I said he was a transitional figure, but was he actually a behaviorist by the end of this? I mean, is he, does he kind of affect some kind of synthesis of behaviorism and cognitive psychology? Or would you still say he's a behaviorist? Yeah,
well, I think by this time, the word behaviorist versus cognitive psychologist, I mean, it was too black and white an issue. There was a transition through Bandura and many, many other people. There were still people who believed in the reinforcement issues, and carried the good stuff from behaviorism forward anyway. Of course, this was sharpened because Chomsky comes along with his article, Verbal Behavior in 1959, and rips Skinner to shreds.
What was the basis of Chomsky's demolition?
Well, he believed that the behaviorists could not account for the acquisition of your first language because there was not enough data in what you learned from your close family and friends in any child or baby to account for the fact that you became a sort of grammatical genius at age 3, which we all do. We don't really learn our first language. It just seems to come to us. And so I'm still with Steven Pinker and others, a lot of serious psychologists are still essentially Chomskyan. Other people are saying, well, actually the behaviorist social influence in learning and languages come back in vogue a little bit, but still fundamentally, the learning, we have these innate abilities in the brain that give us a good foundation for the learning of a language, face recognition, the reading of other minds, and so on and so forth. So I think Chomsky, it was said that he killed behaviorism stone dead in 1959. Not quite. Lots of really good things survived. But as you rightly said, it was more like a bridging. The good stuff carried on, but the strict interpretation of behaviorism as purely experience and positive reinforcement, that had died by that point. It had broadened out through Bandura and Chomsky.
Yeah, I feel a sense of binaries collapsing throughout this conversation.
That's a very good way of putting it, John.
So I'm not going to lie, Donald. Despite what we've found out about the light and shade, I have to say that some of the people in this group give me the creeps. This theme of mistreatment of children and animals running through the stories of Pavlov, Watson and Skinner that you haven't managed to allay my fears about necessarily, because they're not always incidental to the thought, sometimes integral to it. Watson believed it was harmful for mothers to show their children affection. Skinner thought freedom was an illusion. But I think maybe we should leave that aside. I think we've handled that pretty comprehensively. Standing back and trying to actually put these groups into periods, as we've been doing. Audrey Waters says that there is a false narrative that cognitive psychology overcame behaviorism and rooted out, whereas in reality it's incredibly influential for good and ill. And I think you've given a really interesting explanation of why behaviorism still is an influence. It's not just kind of the knee-jerk side of things. She'd say the influence is malign, but you would not, I think. Could you open that question up a bit and talk about, you mentioned a term there, neo-behaviorism. To what extent are behaviorist ideas and concepts still shaping ideas about learning? Where are we now with all this?
Yeah, well, of course, there's the tendency, as I say, to shove all behaviourists into this one box and call them all malign, as it were, but without really doing the deep. I mean, Pressy, Audrey Waters, quotes a great, and wasn't even a behaviourist, and yet is locked into this "everything is malign" narrative. And many of the other people I've mentioned did some very good work in psychology. Even Skinner, to be honest. I mean, if you read Walden 2, Walden 2 is a novel that. It's this utopian community of 1,000 people. And it was built on strong feminist principles, that women were on equal foot with men. In fact, so much so that motherhood had been eradicated. He literally, in Walden 2, eradicates motherhood. All the kids are put on an equal footing like early communist communal life and put into communal kindergartens. There was no cash. It was a 4-hour working day. You got more credit for the unpleasant work you did. There was no class structure, as it were, and people served apprenticeship models. And it was very like Seligman's positive psychology model. So I think this notion that they were all sort of evil, controlling fascists is just a complete and utter myth, to be honest.
It sounds quite close to Brave New World there, Huxley's Brave New World. And he was very influenced by Pavlov, this idea that, of bringing every... Some people would find that quite a chilling idea.
Oh, yeah. I think that's right. But, now that we live in the era of real social engineering, I mean, if you're in the workplace now, you will go on compulsory courses and you will be told what to think. And you will be accused of having things in your unconscious. I don't think any of that's gone away. I think it's as bad now as it perhaps was then.
So if we talk about maybe a little bit about kind of how Watson's branch of endeavour with Madison Avenue has developed, and advertising. Yeah. Huge advertising organisations now like kind of Facebook and Google who work really on kind of nudge principles. Now, is nudge the new behaviorism?
Well, I think you have to start with, let's call it neo-behaviorism. That's not what people call it, but let's call it that, the neo-behaviorist theory and practice that we're living with today. We have, of course, this gathering data from the physical brain, which is a very behaviorist view of the world. Don't rely on subjective views of the world. We have EEG, fMRI, lasers, plethora, loads of non-invasive stuff and scanning techniques that we're using to understand learning theory and how humans think and behave. And then we have these invasive techniques like Neuralink that are really coming on leaps and bounds. So neo-behaviorism is not examining just behavior, but all these internal physiological features as the early behaviorists did. And we're learning a lot from that. And then we also have this carryover through Mager's learning objectives and Gagne's, learning objectives at the beginning of every learning program. That was really a carryover from behaviorism. And people still love that stuff, even though they hate the behaviorists, but they still do it, bizarrely, in my view. Then we have the whole spaced deliberate retrieval practice stuff, where modern science has shown, yes, it does actually work, it is beneficial, and that not doing it means that people, by and large, forget too much. So we have that big influence, the notion that feedback propels the learner that we've discussed through Bandura and modelling, Tolman's latent learning. But another huge influence, and this came through the side door, was through Bandura and social learning. So we have people like Frank, in the social sciences, Franz Boas and Durkheim, this explosion in the social sciences that massively affected learning theory. And still today, we have these two schools. We have all these social constructivists and who are very strong in education departments. But if you nip across to the psychology department, hardly anyone is a social constructivist, in real psychology, academic psychology, because they just don't believe in the tabula rasa or blank slate as the premise in learning. And then you have the games and gamification. I mean, still, loads of people love that stuff. 100% behaviorist, trivial rewards, drills, league tables, badges, all that notion of extrinsic reinforcing motivation. They are the modern behaviorists par excellence in many ways. Behaviorism was picked up, of course, by the AI group, something I'm deeply involved in. Because AI theory itself, you see the word reinforcement learning all the time in the models AI using, and they picked up on, of course, neurons, neural networks, virtual reality, eye tracking in user design. All those cool kids who really love UI and UX. Hey, presto, guess what they're using? They're using eye tracking and heat maps. Exactly what the behaviorists did way back in those days, measuring human behavior to see how people think, that evaluation A/B testing. And then finally, of course, there is the whole marketing and advertising world, SEO, A/B testing, all that is thoroughly behaviorist in its methodology. So behaviorism is here in many, many good ways, but I fear that some have retained a lot of the bad, simplistic reinforcement stuff, games, gamification, so on. And nevertheless, I think the dominant lesson here is that some of the very good stuff has been picked up, that we have to be very careful about what sort of data we read from the human mind in terms of making judgments about it in cognitive psychology, especially in social psychology, where surveys are the norm, but be very wary of what learners tell you about the learning process, as Bjorg and others have shown.
So the TLDR on that, in a way, is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But lastly, if you boil it down to a few key points that learning professionals should take away from the study of behaviorism, what would they be? That sounds really difficult, but want to go?
No, that's a good way. I think the really important points are, first of all, latent learning, this idea that you have to be sensitive to the fact that people learn anyway through experience, in the job, on the job, by doing, and that we shouldn't imagine for one moment that most learning comes through formal interventions. It doesn't. We have to be sensitive to that balance around informal and formal learning. That's the first point. The second point is that reinforcement is still quite important. Spaced practice, deliberate practice, retrieval practice, which is so often ignored, but it's so important. This notion that learning is a process, not an event like a training course or going for a day to some hotel room or whatever, that it's a process. This is what the behaviors really taught us in many ways. And that many of the techniques and their rigor around experimentation are as good today as they were then. So it really is quite important to pick up on eye tracking, for example, if you want to improve an interface, or all that wonderful work that's being done in neuroscience now with Neuralink, where I mentioned the video of the monkey and so on. But we are making amazing discoveries by seeing behaviorism not as the reading of just behavior, but the physiological reading of what happens in the brain. We're making huge advances in that area. And of course, lastly, its impact on AI. There are lots of models in AI that are based on reinforcement learning that are very similar to the work done by the early behaviorists.
Donald, I feel as if this whole session has been an exercise in deconditioning for me. I no longer have a Pavlovian reaction to the word behaviorist. It makes me think bad. You've put a lot of light and shade in there. You've kind of given us a real Bob Ross master class, I think, in how to paint in the light and shade, and something we thought was very simple. Thank you very much.
No problem. God's in the detail, as they say, John.
Was it the devil's in the detail?
Sorry, that's right. I'll say that again.
No, I think both exist. Both are out there.
God and the devil's in the detail. You can cut that bit out.
This season of Great Minds on Learning is brought to you by Learning Pool, the company that helps you deliver exceptional performance with pioneering online learning platforms, creative content and powerful analytics. For a wealth of valuable free white papers and resources on learning, visit learningpool.com/downloads. Great Minds on Learning comes from the Learning Hack team and is produced by John Helmer. Sound edit is by Isaac Peacock. The podcast is based on a series of blog posts written by Donald Clark, and we'd like to thank Donald for his kind collaboration in this project. Our next episode is about the instructionalists. Don't miss it!